Well, we just finished talking about Frederick Jackson Turner and his Frontier Thesis from 1893, and the fact that Turner's ideas became basically the primary narrative, not just of the history of the American West or of westward expansion, but of U.S. history, period, for the better part of a century. So it wasn't just him, and it wasn't just historians who looked specifically at the settlement of the West. There were all different kinds of aspects of U.S. history for which this triumphalist narrative was the main approach. So most people in the 20th century who went through public schools got a big healthy dose of this approach of perpetual progress that overcame all the things that tried to slow it down, and everything just kept getting better and better. Well, historians in general started taking a different approach to things in the 1960s, the mid to late 60s, particularly U.S. historians. They stopped having an exclusive focus on political history, that is, the narrative of political events following one after another, and started looking at things like social history and cultural history. And they stopped looking exclusively at the important white males throughout American history who had always been in the forefront of any examinations of history, and started looking at underrepresented groups, minorities, including women who are not a minority, but certainly underrepresented where power is concerned. And beyond that, also looking at people just closer to the ground level. How were just normal, average people experiencing history, and what can we learn from them? And that got translated into the history of the West in a very powerful and noticeable way in the 1980s, the 80s and into the 1990s, when a whole crop of historians of the American West started looking at things differently and questioning Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis. So these included people like Patricia Limerick Nelson, Richard White, William Cronin, Donald Worster, Elliot West, John Mack Farragher. If you've taken my classes before, you might be familiar with some of these names because I fairly regularly assign books by them in this class, Westward Expansion, and in environmental history, particularly Cronin and Worster, really big names in environmental history. So the approach they brought to it was an attempt to demythologize the American West, not to look at it as the legends had painted it, but to try to present it more as it actually was, and to look at those various groups I just mentioned that had been ignored by previous generations of historians. Now, I said this was in a noticeable way. When these folks started putting out their books in the 80s, they started getting newspaper coverage, and by the early 90s, around the same time people started complaining about, quote, political correctness, people started complaining about, quote, revisionist history, that they were revising American history and that they were moving things all around and changing things. Well, they weren't really. They were just shifting the perspective, looking at different things in different ways. And that's really what history is, you know. Any history is revisionist history because it's looking at something that other people have already looked at and trying to get something new from it. And you do that by, you know, changing the angle, changing the perspective that you are looking from. Well, by the way, this sort of thing is referred to by historians as historiography, the history of the history, in this case, the history of the historians writing the history. And boy, that's fun. Anyway, some of the weaknesses of Turner's thesis that folks like these started to point out. Number one, the whole Triumphalist Narrative. There was an alternative narrative that was offered, the narrative of declension, which is to say that once settlers arrived in the West, particularly where the environment's concerned, they started making things worse, not better. But the triumphalist idea that as Turner was writing in 1893, he was assuming basically that America by 1893 was the pinnacle of social evolution, and it was just getting progressively better and better. Well, that's not necessarily true. Sometimes history, as events unfold, they don't progress. They don't go forward. Time is going forward, but sometimes people move backward. The fact that Turner's thesis only looked at white males. He didn't have anything to say about, well, importantly, didn't have anything to say about the Native Americans who were in the West who were being moved. Didn't really look at other groups, didn't really look at slavery, didn't look at the role of women. Also, that he ignored other important factors that influenced American identity and helped to shape American identity. Now, personally, I think there is something to the idea of always moving westward and getting more land, taking more land, as being one of the elements that made up Americanness. I don't believe it is the sole or even the primary element that shaped American culture. There are other things, like, for example, the Enlightenment that move toward a more scientific approach that started to come about in Europe in the 17th century and was under full sway by the 18th century, that led to philosophers who, like John Locke, for instance, who had huge influences on the thinking of the American colonists, particularly those who would go on to write declarations of independence and constitutions and what have you. Also, the Industrial Revolution was a big thing, as was something that was kind of an American offshoot of that, the Market Revolution, and believe me, we'll be talking about that. Also, slavery and race. Those two things, which were very closely connected, and got started immediately upon the establishment of the English colonies. Well, within a little over a decade, those things would be huge factors in how things unfolded. So you can't just write all of those out of the equation. Another thing that was questioned by them about Turner is that he put so much emphasis on the individuality, being self-sufficient, being self-made, that as being the American ideal, which is why people were attracted to the romanticized vision of the frontiersman and the cowboy. And we'll be talking at length about that stuff too. But the fact is, that there was kind of a dichotomy in the whole westward expansion thing and in the establishment of the country. There's two sides to the coin: the individual and the community. Now, immediately before the Revolution was even over, the quote-unquote founding fathers were arguing over which one of those was most important and should hold sway. When it comes to the frontier, though, community was important there as well. Like the cowboy. The cowboy is sometimes presented as the epitome of the rugged individual. He rides off into the sunset alone. But the fact is that if the cowboy is employed at all, if he has a job, he's not the only one there. It takes a bunch of cowboys to move a herd of cattle. And everyone has to have a role. Everyone has their specific part to play in the team. And there was an expression in the late 1800s among cowboys, and that was you got to ride for the brand. That is to say, you have to have loyalty to your outfit, not your suit of clothes, but the group of cowboys that you are working alongside, all employed by the owner of the ranch, the owner of the brand. And even in the frontier myth, even in the Western genre of movies and novels, the cowboy comes in, first the frontiersmen and the trappers come in, and the cowboys, but ultimately always the ultimate goal in that myth is to establish civilization, and civilization arrives when the churches and the schools get built, and when the families are there building a community. Even among the mountain men, those guys who were fur trappers that lived up in the Rocky Mountains, often living lives of isolation. They weren't in complete isolation. They couldn't stand the idea of it. They had this thing called the rendezvous over in the Powder River country in Montana once a year back in the 1820s and 1830s. A great big, huge fair-like party in which all the mountain men would come down out of the mountains and have fun and gather together and sing and dance and gamble and race horses and stuff. So the idea that the lone rugged individual is the be-all and end-all of either westward expansion or of American history is incomplete. Now you can't exclude that either. You have to look at both sides of that coin. And if you think about it, really American politics from the establishment of the country forward has been a pushing and pulling, a tension between the idea of the individual versus the community. Anyway, these things, these ideas about the rugged individual, things like that. I keep mentioning that they're part of the myth. So I want to talk about Richard Slotkin, not a historian, by the way, but an English professor who specializes in mythology and particularly the American version of it. He views the American frontier as the American national myth. Now, a national myth is more than just a myth that people believe all around the country. It's a specific kind of thing. It is the myth of the nation, the myth of the origin of a nation. And we're not just looking at the U.S., we're looking at any nation. So when a nation is formed historically out of either, maybe a group of tribes who are living in the same area, maybe they're interrelated, maybe they're linguistically related, and often they're not, but they come together to form a nation. They have to come up with a story that they all agree to believe, and that they all agree this is going to be our national story. And part of that idea is that their nation, whatever it is, even though it may not have been a nation until relatively recently, was really always there. It was sleeping. It was just waiting to be awoken. In order to do that, you need something to bind the people together. So common ancestry is one way, Another way to decide what binds the people together and what establishes a community is to pick out people who are very different and exclude them, make them the other. That helps to define who you are by showing who you're not. Well, before I go any further, let's take a look at these books by Richard Slotkin, a trilogy. If you are taking this class because you're really deeply interested in the American West, particularly in the mythology of it and the viewpoints of it, you need to read these books. I don't assign these books in class because each one is like huge. I mean, huge. But I highly recommend them if you're really interested in this sort of thing. So let's look at some foundational myths from other countries. You know, in England, they've got the Arthurian cycle, stories of King Arthur, and also Robin Hood. So the King Arthur stories are set in the early Middle Ages when the Britons were resisting invasion from Rome, or shortly after that time period. Robin Hood is set during the Crusades, after the Norman conquest, when the Anglo-Saxons were being oppressed. In France, they have the story of Roland. Le Chanson de Roland is the Song of Roland, is an epic poem from France. It takes place during the time of Charlemagne, or Charlemagne, during the 8th, 9th century. Roland was a warrior, a leader of Charlemagne's forces, who made a heroic last stand kind of sacrifice thing. In Spain, there is the legend, semi-historical, semi-legendary, of El Cid, who was a Spaniard who led the resistance against the Moors, against the Muslim forces from North Africa who had controlled Spain for so long. In Ireland, you have the story of, you have a lot of different things. One of them is the legend of Cuchulainn, who was an ancient Irish warrior, very similar to El Cid and to Roland, in that he went out fighting and inspired his followers to rise up. He went out with his back against a rock wall with his spear, taking on countless enemies one at a time until they overwhelmed him. In Germany, you've got the story of Siegfried and Brunhild. Siegfried and the ring of the Nibelung, and there's dragons and dwarves, and it becomes the focus of the Nibelungenlied, the Wagnerian operas. Also, big influence on Tolkien. So, all these things last through the centuries and become a part of how that group of people continue even to define themselves. And, the United States, a relatively young country compared to all these other countries, all these other groups. Slotkin says, and pretty much anybody would agree, that it is the frontier, the American frontier, that plays that role in American culture. So, the Western genre kind of goes up and down. Westerns were really popular in the 1930s, and then in the late 40s it looked like they were kind of on their way out. Then they had a comeback, and then they started going down again in the 70s, and virtually were gone by the 80s, and they started to come back in the 90s. My point here is that they may never be as prominent as they were at their height, but they will never completely disappear because they are part of the American myth. Just like they are always going to be telling stories about King Arthur and Robin Hood. Different versions of the same story for different generations. All right, well, let's take a look at the idea of the West even before Columbus arrived. I kind of hinted at that earlier. I said this stuff's going to happen even before Columbus. There's going to be this strange preoccupation with the West. Why is that? The West, in mythology in general, in European mythology and also Asian mythology, represents something mysterious. Why? It's where the sun goes down. It's where the sun sets. It's the land of night. And what's out there? What awaits us if we go further to the west? If you're in Europe, You go so far west, and then you reach the Atlantic Ocean, which was a huge obstacle for many, many centuries. In addition, because of its connection to nightfall and to mystery, the land of the West frequently was a place where heroes would journey on their quests to find mysterious things, to find magical artifacts or whatever, because the West was often viewed as the land of the gods or the land of dreams because of the nightfall thing, or the land of death. Traveling westward towards sundown, your sunset is your end, and we don't know what awaits after that. Sometimes, therefore, connected to the underworld. And like I said, that's not just Europe. In China, one of the 5 classic Chinese novels, 5 most famous all time, is called, well, it can be translated Journey to the West. Sometimes it's translated Into the West. And it's about this guy who travels westward to find the powerful sutras, the sacred scriptures of Buddha, and bring them back to his world. And that has been read down through the ages. There's been a gazillion different Chinese movie versions of it. I put this picture here because once in class I was talking about this book and someone said, "Hey, is that the one with a monkey guy?" Yes, that's the one with the monkey guy. There he is. All right, so that's the background of the European way of thinking at the time they began to colonize the New World. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to take a look at their goals for being there and their behavior once they got there. Then we're going to take a long look at Native American culture, particularly where attitudes toward nature are concerned. So all this is just kind of to set the stage for what happens next. The first European colonists, of course, not counting the Norse in the 10th, 11th century, but in the 15th and into the 16th century, the first European colonists were from Spain, or working for Spain. So many of those explorers, also known, particularly once they hit land, as conquistadores, or conquerors. That's exactly what they were. Many of them were extremely brutal, sometimes outright genocidal, intentionally genocidal sometimes. Don't even get me started on Christopher Columbus. But one important thing to bear in mind about those people from Spain who went over in the 1490s and into the 1500s, they were not your typical average everyday Spanish people. They were adventurers. They were essentially mercenaries looking to get rich. They weren't looking to expand the horizons of science. They were looking to find a bunch of valuable stuff and get a cut of it. Primarily, they were looking for valuable minerals. So their tactics were more brutal than probably the average person would be. This is why, I guess I am getting started on Columbus. This is why when people say it's not fair to judge Christopher Columbus by modern day standards, I agree. But it is fair to judge him by the standards of his own time, when a lot of the average people in Spain were just freaked out by how brutal he was. And if you didn't know it, he was eventually arrested for mismanaging the colony and sent back in chains. So just your typical baker or barber from a Spanish city might not have responded and reacted the same way. In fact, there was a movement throughout the 16th century in Spain for protecting and preserving the rights of the native peoples, los indios, of the New World, that gained a pretty large following and led to some changes. So bear that in mind. looking to improve their lives and move up the social hierarchy, the gears of which can be greased quite a bit by finding lots of gold and silver. Spain, France, and England were ultimately the big three European powers in North America. The Dutch almost squeezed into that group. It looked like they were going to early on, but they wound up ultimately not having as much of an impact as these three. And in addition to them, there were the Swedish that you don't normally think of, but they had a couple of colonies, and there were Russians on the west coast. But these were the big three. Now I mentioned that when Spain arrived there, they were mainly, when they first arrived, as you're aware, it was by accident because Columbus was looking for a shortcut to India so that they could access those spices and silks and so forth. But barring that, they were hoping to have particularly mineral resources, gold and silver. So that's mainly what they were after. The French were mainly after trade. That was their principal aim on the continent of North America, not the islands of the Caribbean. That wound up being, the production of sugar wound up being their big goal there. But in North America, on the continent, it was the fur trade with the Native Americans. And because they weren't trying to displace the Indians and they weren't trying to force them into labor like the Spanish were doing to extract their minerals, but they wanted to trade with them, it was in their best interests to have the best relations possible with the native tribes. So compared to the Spanish and the English, by the way, after land primarily, compared to them, the French got along much better with the native population. And the native tribes would usually side with them if they had the chance over the English or even the Spanish. They also, because their goal was trade, not agriculture, such as England, for their use of the land, or mining primarily, they had less of an environmental impact as well compared to the Spanish and especially the English. So, depending on what their goals were, that would influence both how they interacted with native tribes and how they interacted with the land. Now, I made a distinction there with the French in the Caribbean. The French also had colonies in other parts of the world. It would be easy to assume, because they got along so well with the native tribes in North America compared to other Europeans, that they were just nicer people to deal with, but that's not really true. Because in the areas of the world, including places like what is now Haiti and Martinique in the Caribbean, where their goals were different, where their goals were extractive, they were just as bad and in some cases worse than any other European power in how they treated the land and the people on it. So bear that in mind, though, in what would become the United States. The goal of the colonizing powers is going to be very important. All right, so the next thing we'll do is we're now going to focus in specifically on the English and how they viewed the land when they got there.